and then we'll begin. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the Howell Speaker Series hosted by the University of Virginia. This is a series that seeks to highlight the excellent work that is being done on the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf. And we're lucky that there's a lot of excellent work that's being done on the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf these days. It's also an opportunity for all of us who work on the region to see one another and to connect to one another beyond the usual academic conferences, which these days are few and far between anyway. But the hope is that this keeps going, and even in the post-Zoom world that we'll hopefully transition into one day, we'll keep the Zoom embers glowing, the Zoomers glowing over in this corner of the internet, so that people from around the country and around the world can tune in and participate. This series is made possible thanks to the generous support of Ambassador Nathaniel Howell and Marge Howell, who spent decades in various diplomatic roles in the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. I'm personally grateful to the Howells for their support, not just for the program here at UVA, but also for their support of the Gulf Studies community writ large. Okay, on to today's talk. I'm happy to host Michael Christopher Lowe, an assistant professor of history at Iowa State University and currently a research fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi. Chris is the author of Imperial Mecca, Ottoman Arabia and the Indian Ocean Hajj, published just a month ago by Columbia University Press. The book is an impressive inter-imperial history of the pilgrimage to Mecca and its governance. Over the course of 6 chapters paired together into 3 parts, Chris explores the questions of jurisdiction and international law that the Hajj raised for the Ottomans as increasing numbers of British Indian subjects began to arrive in the Hijaz. He examines the challenges posed by the spread of diseases, particularly cholera, to the Ottoman administration of the region, and the attempts that the Ottomans engaged in to combat the spread of the disease. And he explores the business of the Hajj and attempts to regulate the pilgrimage through the networks of brokers, businessmen, and Bedouins who performed various services. All told, what we get is a textured account of the 19th and early 20th century Hijaz and the nested struggles from the very local to the global that shaped the Hajj during that time period. It goes without saying that I highly recommend the book. Lowe is impressive in his ability to read across multiple archives and languages and to pull them together into a coherent story. And on top of that, it is a very good read. And so I highly recommend it. And it's not very expensive at all. And it's in paperback, so well worth the price. So I'm going to start off with a series of questions to Chris. And then at roughly 12:30, I'll shift over to Q&A. Okay, so Chris, thanks for joining us. To just sort of get us talking about the book and some of the themes, I wonder if you could tell us why was the Hajj useful for you to think of as a site of governance of inter-imperial politics? What is the purchase of thinking across empires here?
First of all, Fahad, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and get to speak with you today. I think that what I'd like to do is start with the inter-imperiality question and sort of flesh out the governance part in just a moment. So why do an inter-imperial history pairing British India or the British Indian Ocean with the Ottoman Hijaz? So obviously sort of my entry point into this was pandemic cholera. That was sort of the hook that really got me into this and was the subject of really the first piece that I did on this many moons ago, back in 2008, an IJMIS article that sort of revolved around this question of cholera. But from a really a wider perspective, I think that the book sort of does a couple of things. So on the one hand, it's a book about Hajj, and then on the other hand, it's also a book about the Hijaz itself. And I see sort of 2 sets of interlocking inter-imperial problems that emerge for the Ottomans. So on the one hand, if we sort of think of it as sort of two baskets, if you will, Hijazi autonomy on the one hand, and then on the other, British extraterritoriality. So on the autonomy side of the ledger, you have things like Bedouin violence and raiding. These are sort of more traditional issues that we might associate with the land-based Hajj. The Sharif of Mecca as a kind of would-be independent ruler. We might think of sort of the worst Ottoman fears in the 19th century is that you would have another Mehmed Ali Pasha another Khedivate of Egypt that sort of spins off and creates its own set of issues, becomes occupied by foreign power. Another question is the Hijaz as a sort of imperfect pillar of pan-Islamic symbolism and public imagery, right? We tend to think of that as so quintessential for the Hamidian era, but it was really a sort of project that only started to be constructed in the 1880s, right? So you already have a sort of British challenge that you're meeting at the sort of outset of the creation of those kinds of public imagery. An awkwardness really in applying modernizing reform to an autonomous, extremely distant and tribal frontier, and a religiously conservative one as well. And then on the sort of British extraterritorial side, we have attempts to extend the principles of the capitulations to the Muslim Holy Land, a quite kind of flabbergasting sort of turn of events for the Ottomans, attempts to extend consular jurisdiction over British colonial Muslim subjects, attempts to portray the British Empire as a kind of protector of pilgrimage, of a protector of Muslim rights and safety while on Hajj, right? Sort of chipping away at the image of the Ottoman Sultan as the sort of sole custodian of the pilgrimage. And then also a sort of British flirtation with the promotion of an independent Sharif of Mecca as a would-be caliph. Now, throughout the book, I'm very careful to say that this was a sort of on again, off again fantasy, but it certainly formed part of the middle landscape that affected both empires. And while I'm, I think, very careful to sort of throw cold water on pan-Islam, at the same time, it constitutes a sort of elephant in the room that doesn't really sort of leave throughout the 19th century. Now, a few things I think about inter-imperiality. Really, many of the questions related to the Hajj in this book were inspired by reading global, Indian Ocean, British Empire, and South Asian history. So I think that to sort of have left the British Empire out of the picture and to do a sort of more traditional Istanbul and your favorite province sort of book, which unfortunately is sort of too rampant in the field of Ottoman studies, I think would have done this a real disservice, right? So in some respects, this is sort of me reading this Indian Ocean literature and trying to sort of speak back with Ottoman Turkish sources, with Turkish secondary literature, with Arabic sources, and find some different answers to the kinds of questions that emerge in those fields that really, again, it really inspired me. I would also say that in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a real explosion of interest in the sort of field of Hajj studies, right? Like the colonial Hajj became its own kind of field. Eileen Kane's wonderful book on Russian governance of the Hajj, John Slight's on the British Empire, of course, Eric Tagliacozzo's on Southeast Asia. But, you know, Mecca itself, the Ottoman Hijaz, the Hajj sort of on land, the sort of Muslim center, if you will, of the Hajj, this sort of presence of a Muslim sovereign at the heart of the story was missing. And so it was as if you had a kind of donut, right? Everything was sort of flowing in from the colonial periphery, and the very center was left out of the story. Now into that void, I can't sort of say that I'm the only one here. So my good friend and colleague, Lale John, who I think is with us today, also her wonderful book, Spiritual Subjects on Central Asian Pilgrims and their experience of Hajj, really sort of helps together, I think, to sort of give us some sense of what's happening at the center of this story. Now, I would also sort of stress that the Hajj itself is an inter-imperial process in the colonial period, right? So starting from a question like cholera, steamship governance, passports, none of these things could be adjudicated solely by the Ottoman Sultan. Sort of to be Khadim al-Haramain and Sharafain was no longer a sort of a standalone role, right? So all of this had to be coordinated with French Algeria, Russian Central Asia, the Dutch East Indies, British India, and the sort of list goes on and on and on. So the Hajj itself became internationalized in the 19th century. So it really, to me, makes no sense to sort of solely do a sort of Ottoman-only sort of story. Now, I would also just say that I would just lay some stress on the degree to which the Ottoman Hijaz was a part of the Indian Ocean and was deeply entangled with British plans for the Muslim world, was deeply entangled with diasporic populations, both from South Asia and Southeast Asia. And so to sort of populate an Ottoman Hijaz and not have Indian, Jawi, and other Indian Ocean characters, Hadramis, it really doesn't sort of make sense. It's only half the story if you're sort of telling a sort of struggle between the Sharifate of Mecca and his Bedouin levies, versus a modernizing Istanbul. So I wanted all of those characters to sort of be in the mix all the time. I would also just say that trying to think about the Hijaz as part of the Arabian Peninsula was very appealing to me. And so in many respects, this was an attempt to come to grips with the degree to which the Hijaz was part of a sort of British fantasy of an extended British empire or British Indian Ocean empire that included princely states in South Asia, treaty sheikdoms in the Gulf, sort of indirect rule in a variety of places in Africa, Aden, for example, and to try and think about the Hijaz and the Sharifate of Mecca as just one more potential victim of this sort of collection of princely states, and to think about how British autonomy sort of fit perfectly within that existing British script. Okay, so having sort of laid out some stakes on inter-imperiality, let me say a few things about governance. Now, I think the last few years have seen some interesting debates on Ottoman Orientalism, notions of a civilizing mission on the Arab frontier, really sort of questions about the resurgence of the Ottoman Empire in places like Hijaz and Yemen, and asking the question, is this something new, right? Is this old Ottoman imperialism, or is this something akin to colonialism? Is it a kind of Ottoman colonialism? So we think about really fantastic works, Sama Makdisi, Salim Deringil, Thomas Kuhn, Mustafa Minawi, to sort of name a few, who sort of wrestled with these questions. And these were really generative for me, but in the end, I kind of came away with the feeling that I didn't feel comfortable calling this the same thing, right? The Ottomans were being victimized by this much more powerful colonial empire, and to sort of say that what they're doing in response is the exact same thing didn't exactly make sense to me. It didn't really sort of set well in the final analysis. So I would say most of this literature has been a kind of post-colonial analysis of rhetoric, right? This sort of civilizing mission on the frontier, thinking about, what Istanbul wanted to do with those backwards savage Bedouins, and sort of analyzing that kind of talk, if you will, in the documents. And I would just sort of answer back to that. What about the actual day-to-day mechanics of attempting to modernize at the absolute logistical limit of the empire, and also while being threatened by the sort of looming presence, extraterritorial reach of this other, mammoth force in the Indian Ocean, the British Empire? I think the same problem is true of work on the Hamidian period and Pan-Islam, another sort of rhetorical, symbolic literature that's based on public imagery, right? But it often ignores the material, the technical, the logistics of day-to-day governing, right? And so when you dig down and drill down into what protects the sovereignty of the Hijaz, how do the Ottomans deal with international law? How do they set up quarantine rules? How do they provide water infrastructure? Do they let pilgrims buy real estate, for example? You get some really surprising answers, because Pan-Islam actually sort of has a certain friction with the kind of border control, governmentality, and sovereignty, the sort of national sovereignty that they're trying to impose at the time. So I think we come up with some surprising answers if we look beneath that kind of, very high-flown rhetoric and look for something new. So I'll stop there. I think I may have said too much.
No, that's terrific, and I'm actually gonna try to pick up on the last points that you were making and maybe get you to amplify them a little bit. I mean, thinking of the Ottoman Empire within this world of moving pilgrims, ships, vectors of diseases, these flows that Indian Ocean historians are so interested in, that really shape the literature on that region. What does that do, thinking about these sorts of things, for thinking about the historiography of the Ottoman Empire? How does your work take on this sort of pervasive narrative of Ottoman decline in the 19th and early 20th century? And how does thinking from the perspective of the Indian Ocean and thinking inter-imperially force us to rethink that narrative?
Yeah, I think, uh, if we think about the timing of when a lot of these sort of schemes of modernization and, for lack of a better term, a kind of nascent technopolitics sort of take root in my book, we can see in Thomas Kuhn's work, for example, 1840s through the 1870s, an attempt to sort of reconquer Yemen as a sort of bulwark against sort of European colonialism coming into the Red Sea. In the Hijaz, I see these things start to really sort of get into motion in the 1880s. So this is actually quite late. And this sort of reconstitution of these frontier provinces so late, I think gives us a sense that the Ottoman Empire, even as we sort of think of it as in decline, is actually quite dynamic and is really trying to sort of meet these challenges. The other part of this that I think is really interesting is to look at these frontier provinces as sort of laboratories of the possible, right? We tend to sort of think of things as a sort of, a final analysis. Well, you make it to World War I and you lose, the empire is lost, and you transition to a republic. But I think that sort of elides so many of these success stories and their sort of ability to really sort of reorganize themselves on the fly, and not just in the Tanzimat period. I think that was one of the things that I was maybe most interested in, is that we tend to equate modernization and this process of adaptation with the Tanzimat period. And in fact, a lot of the sort of state structures and bureaucratic structures, and then sort of more technical big projects, if you will, they're actually executed during the Hamidian period in the last 30 to 40 years of the empire. And I mean, I just sort of constantly was marveling. I mean, I'll just give a couple of examples here. One of my big, surprise discoveries in the archive was in the 1890s through World War I that the Ottomans were experimenting with desalination systems in places like Cameron Island, in Hudaydah, in Jeddah, and other parts of the empire as well. I mean, the sort of complexity of this kind of technical thinking is not something that matches neatly with our sort of image of the sick man of Europe. I mean, another sort of thing that really sort of stands out to me is a question of cholera, right? So if we're going to talk about the sick man of Europe, we can talk in quite literal terms. On the one hand, you have an Ottoman Empire that's adopting the latest advances from Robert Koch and Pasteur on bacteriology and germ theory. And then on the other hand, you have British India mired in miasma theory about cholera, denying the latest science, right? And so I think that, again, if we look underneath these sort of big headlines of sick man of Europe, we get quite a different story.
All right. One of the tensions that runs through the entire book is the relationship between the Ottoman administration and Istanbul specifically, and the local power holders in the Hijaz, and the possibilities that this relationship enables, but also the efforts that it frustrates. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about it. When was this relationship useful to the Ottomans? When did this relationship turn against them? And how is thinking about this tension, the sort of imperial and local tension, how was it useful for you?
Sure. So, when we think about local power holders in an Ottoman context, so in Ottoman studies, you think about sort of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and attempts to sort of crush warlords or ions, and sort of centralize the state, right? But one of the things that I think that overlooks is that we think of the 19th century as this story of centralization, homogenization of Ottoman rule, at least in core territories in the Balkans and Anatolia, and a more spotty process the further out that you get towards the peripheries. But one of the things that I think comes through really clearly in my colleague Amy Janelle's work on international law and autonomy is that this huge swath of provinces, the Eyalet-e Mumtaze, so-called autonomous or privileged provinces, and provinces as different as North Africa, Egypt, Lebanon, a variety of places in the Balkans, the Hijaz, all have these special arrangements, longstanding, sometimes more recent agreements with the center that are not centralized. And so if you sort of look at a sort of roster of all of the provinces, these supposedly exceptional places are actually the rule, right? And so this was one of the things that bugged me quite a bit about Hijazi history, right? Is you would talk to people and they say, well, the Tanzimat, none of that stuff applies. They didn't do any of that stuff in the Hijaz. Well, that's just not true, right? So many of these sort of big state structures have impacts whether or not they were intended to. Now, certainly they didn't abolish the slave trade in the Hijaz because it was sort of, too tenuous. You didn't have things like censuses or cadastral surveys in the same way that you did in other places, taxation, military reforms in the same way. But then other things like nationality policy, passports, quarantine, medical procedures that are equally parts of the Tanzimat show up sort of quite strongly. And so I wanted to sort of hold this tension throughout the book of these modernizing, centralizing projects that weren't supposed to show up in the Hijaz, but they kept coming, right? They kept showing up and popping up and causing all kinds of tension, right? Either with these European colonial subjects from different places, but in particular British India, with the Bedouin, with the Sharifate of Mecca, with urban Hijazis, right? The traditional enemy, right, is the Bedouin. I mean, that's the way that we think about the sort of the brakes on progress are the Bedouin. But in fact, urban Hijazis also played their part in frustrating the Ottoman central government's plans, because in many ways they were invested in the Indian Ocean economies that were connected to the steamship in India and the Dutch East Indies, etc. And I would also just say that, the autonomy was sort of the cracked door, right? That you could send in governor after governor with plans to centralize, to reform things, but autonomy sort of created an environment where plans that were hatched in Istanbul were extremely difficult to execute with a sort of shared, sort of layered sovereignty. And that confusion between governor and Sharifate, and sometimes outright coordination in terms of corruption, really sort of opened the door for more and more extraterritorial influence coming in from the colonial world.
Thank you. That's terrific. I mean, I have so many more questions. I want to open it up to Q&A, but before I do want to ask you one, make sure I get my question in there. This is a series, at least on the face of it, on the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf. Well, you and I are both people who are invested in the literature on other parts of the world, including the Indian Ocean. And I wanted to take this opportunity of having somebody like you over here to ask, what sorts of questions did this project bring up for you in terms of how to better bring the literature on the Arabian Peninsula in closer conversation with that of the Indian Ocean, which, there are works that are trying to bring them together. But I wonder if you could reflect a little bit from the perspective of your own work on the sort of the promises and perils, and so just or
Yeah.
whatever it is for our audience over here.
I think this is sort of a two-pronged problem, right? The Arabian Peninsula sits in between fields. So there's a kind of traditional Middle East, and I would sort of say that the core narratives of that traditional Middle East revolve around the Ottoman Empire, Arab nationalism after the Ottoman Empire, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. And for better or worse, these trajectories of modernization and nationalism, those are sort of the backbone stories of what makes it into the textbook of, a course on the Middle East, right? Arabia, Iran, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, they tend to not make it into the story, or they show up whenever oil shows up. You can, open, many of our leading textbooks written by wonderful people who are really, really smart. And, the Arabian Peninsula doesn't show up unless there's a mention of Wahhabism or oil, if at all, right? And so you can sort of see that the Arabian Peninsula is sort of lopped off the region. And there are some reasons for that, right? It's very difficult, I think, to make sense of the story of Aden or Yemen or Oman or Kuwait or even the Hijaz, right? Without reference to British India, the Raj, and that sort of universe, right? Those mobile flows, the Hajj, all of those things have to sort of come into the picture. And I think you can't sort of do the work of looking at the Arabian Peninsula without British archives, unfortunately. Now, that part of that is a sort of legacy of the relative closed nature of some of these Gulf states in terms of archival material, right? So the sort of necessity, I think, of going to the British sources and sort of pairing them with something. It could be Arabic, it could be Persian, it could be Ottoman, becomes really evident to me. So I think it's a sort of two-way street. I don't think that we can recover the Arabian Peninsula and really make sense of it without both of those sides of the picture. And for me, at least, I did, Arabic training in Yemen, and that was sort of my first big exposure to the Arab world. And to me, for what I was seeing on the ground looked like part of the Indian Ocean. It didn't look like the sort of world as narrated from Cairo or Beirut or Istanbul that we see in, I guess, most of what is conventionally Middle Eastern studies. So I felt like it was a sort of, necessary move to sort of use Indian Ocean historiographic questions and Indian Ocean archival materials to really sort of solve that conundrum. Now, I'll just sort of say, maybe finally, I have some hope for the future, right? That we are starting to get a little bit more momentum. And I think part of that's because of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, I think that because of the lack of access to some of the more traditional centers, that projects are starting to drift a little bit more into the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. So we may have a little bit of a rebalancing underway as we speak, but we'll see how that plays out.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to turn off the recording now so we can move our way into